Good Tuesday morning, and welcome to Begin in the Word. Today we're going to continue our study of the story of Job. We're studying the story of Job with a focus on human suffering. What is God's part in human suffering? What is Satan's role in human suffering? And how should we as God's children respond to human suffering? In today's study, we're going to talk about Job's continued losses. In Job chapter 7 and verse 5, Job later in his discussing his problems with his friends talked about the symptoms of his disease. He said, "My flesh is caked with worms and dust. My skin is cracked and breaks out afresh." In Job 30 and verse 30, continuing to bemoan the magnitude of his physical sickness, Job said, "My skin grows black and falls from me. My bones burn with fever." Here we find passages that reiterate the magnitude of Job's physical suffering. In Monday morning study, we found in Job chapter 2 where Satan was allowed by God to afflict Job's health, and we see where he was broken out with painful boils. As far as the information is concerned from chapter 2, we could make a lot of guesses at what exactly was wrong with Job's health, and they would be just that, guesses. But here we have more information that Job gives us that gives a little more insight into his sickness. Apparently, as these boils festered, they became caked with worms and with dirt. That is an awful, awful mental image there. But that's what Job, the man of God, was having to endure. He went on to describe how his skin was cracked and breaks out afresh. So it would seem that after one boil might heal or slightly improve, that a new one would break out, or perhaps additional ones were added to the first outbreak. He later on talked about his skin becoming blackened and sloughing off or falling from him. What a terrible thing he was enduring. But he also said that his bones burned with fever. So whatever sickness Job had, it was making him run a fever. When we check different biblical scholars to see what the ideas are out there about Job's sickness, probably one of the most common ideas was that he had a disease referred to as elephantitis. And I've looked up information about elephantitis, looked up pictures about how it manifests itself, and I'll tell you that the pursuit of that information is not for the squeamish at heart. It's a very unsightly disease, and when you read about it and you look at the pictures of what it causes with a person, and then you read Job's complaints about his physical ailments, you can see why a lot of people think that's the disease that he had. Whatever the disease was, it kept his skin constantly breaking out. Worms were eating at his festering sores. His skin was growing black and sloughing off, and he was burning up with fever. But physical ailment wasn't the only thing that Job suffered. Job also suffered emotional distress. We've got 3 scriptures for you on the screen here that will talk about these. In Job 6 and verse 4, he said, "The arrows of the Almighty are within me. My spirit drinks in their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me." This is a terrifying presentation of Job's state at heart. And I say terrifying from the standpoint of feeling sympathy or empathy for Job. I want to observe that part of what he says here reflects a misunderstanding. Job says the arrows of the Almighty are within him. He thinks his problems are served up by the hand of God. Well, we know from the narrative what Job didn't have the advantage of knowing. These problems weren't from God. They were from Satan. So there's a sense of paranoia here in what Job is saying. He's insinuating he felt like God was angry with him. He goes on to talk about those arrows afflicting him and how his spirit was drinking in their poison. And then he says, "The terrors of God are arrayed against me." So he's describing a state of heart wherein he was terrified. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in these studies breaking down the poetry of Job, though there is great beauty to be found in its poetry and a lot of intrigue if you enjoy the study of literature. But let's notice here a sequence in parallel statements where Job, with each passing phrase, intensifies the degree of his suffering. He starts out by talking about arrows being shot at him by God. But then he adds that these arrows are poison, and his spirit is drinking in that poison. So we start out with the idea of an archer shooting at you, and then he adds to that the arrows that they're shooting as poison arrows. So that increases the magnitude of the difficulty. And then he speaks of God's terrors being arrayed against him. Now, again, this was a misunderstanding. God wasn't mad at Job, but that's what he felt at the time. And that speaks to us about our state of heart when we're suffering. Sometimes when we're suffering problems, it's easy to get that feeling that God is mad at us, and that adds to our terrors. And with Job's explanation of his feelings along those lines, he speaks of them as being arrayed against him. So there's the idea of archers shooting arrows laced with deadly poison, and then the idea of there being several archers lined up or arrayed in battle against him. So with each parallel phrase in this parallelism, you have an increase, a dramatic increase of the difficulty. Arrows, poison arrows, and multiple archers arrayed in battle against me with these arrows. All, Job mistakenly thought, at the hand of God. And that afflicted his heart. It's one thing for you to have a fever. It's one thing to have sores on your skin, but it's something else to be laying there with a terrifying thought as you suffer in the dust that God is against me. God is mad at me, and I don't know what he's done to me. I don't know why. This speaks to us about the magnitude, the emotional magnitude of human suffering. He went on later in Job 7 and verse 14 to protest against God. You scare me with dreams. You terrify me with visions. Here's another parallelism. Both phrases are saying the same thing. In Job 6 and verse 4, it's kind of a progressive parallelism where the parallel phrases become progressively stronger. Here it's a synaptic or synonymous parallelism where they're both saying the same thing. You frighten me with dreams. You terrify me with visions. It would seem that when Job was able to sleep, in his sleep, he would be awakened by terrifying dreams or bad dreams. Well, of course, that often happens to a person when they're suffering emotionally. There's a place later in the book where Job talks about how that during the day he just can't wait till he's able to lay down at night and go to sleep and end this miserable day. And then he lays down at night to sleep and he can't sleep and he's awakened by these frightening dreams. And so he can't wait till the dawn so he can get up and live another day. And so in the day he can't wait for night, and the nighttime he can't wait for daytime. And all of that speaks of the compounding emotional misery that he was feeling. Job, in Job 31 and verse 23, talked about God being a terror to him. He had become frightened by God. It said, because of his magnificence, I cannot endure. He reached a point where he thought, I can't stand this any longer. He's having night terrors. He's having emotional anxiety during the day. Job is suffering. He believes God is mad at him. And the magnitude of his emotional suffering is immeasurable. It's reached the point he feels like he can't stand anymore. But he also suffered socially. In Job 12 and verse 4, Job said, I am one mocked by his friends, who called on God, and he answered him, the just and blameless, who is ridiculed. He's saying, I've been a faithful servant to God. Is that true? That's what the narrative said about him at the beginning of the book. That's what God said about him in his discussion with Satan. But his friends accused him of doing evil. His friends mistakenly believed that he was suffering because he had done something against the will of God. And so they mocked Job, and they said harsh things against him that really amounted to ridicule. Job later in Job 16 and verse 20 protested that his friends scorned him. And he said, "My eyes pour out tears to God." What a pitiful picture of his suffering. He went on in Job 17 and verse 6 to talk about not just his friends, but others in the community speaking ill of him. It said that he has made me a byword of the people. I have become one in whose face men spit. Imagine this scene. Job covered in boils, scraping his sin, skin turning black and sloughing off, burning up with fever, pouring out tears to God, grieving the loss of his children, suffering the financial loss that he had endured, and people coming by, making a byword out of him, speaking evil against him, even spitting on him as he sat there and suffered. What a terrible emotional agony he must have endured. Job 21 and 3, he said, "Bear with me that I may speak, and after that I have spoken, keep mocking." So Job is just resolving himself to deal with this onslaught of mockery that he was receiving from people there in the community, and apparently how he characterized the words of his friends as speaking against him. So he steeled his resolve that he's going to stand firm and stay faithful to God, even though life has become so difficult for him. In Job 19, verse 18 and 19, he said, "Even young children despise me. I arise and they speak against me. All my close friends abhor me, and those whom I love have turned against me." Job felt all alone. Even little children from the area where he lived would speak against him. In Job 30 and verse 1, verse 9 and 10, in verse 12, he talked about the manner of this despising, or the way this mockery revealed itself. It says, "But now they mock at me, men younger than I, whose fathers I disdain to put with the dogs of my flock." These weren't just people of the village, but they were lowly people. Apparently, in Job's mind, people that were sinful and of ill repute. And these people were mocking at Job. In verse 9 and 10, "Now I am their taunting song. Yes, I am their byword. They abhor me. They keep far from me. They do not hesitate to spit in my face." In verse 12, "At my right hand the rabble arises. They push away my feet. They raise up against me the ways of their destruction." So Job has used different metaphors here to describe the way he suffered. We read earlier where he used a metaphor of military activity, of archers and shooting pain at him. And here he just talks about being people's taunting song. Apparently, people of the area where Job lived were just coming at him and singing mocking songs against him and rising up and accusing him like his friends accused him of doing some awful thing to deserve all this calamity. All the while, Job tenaciously held to his faith. I want you to think about these things, and I want to challenge you. Number one, let's understand how awful it is to falsely accuse somebody. All these people that spoke against Job, they were falsely accusing him. He had done no wrong to merit the magnitude of the things that he had to endure, and God said so himself in the narrative of the book. But also, let's consider how we can have compassion on those who are suffering because of not just the physical nature of suffering, but the emotional suffering. We read where Job described a great magnitude of emotional suffering. And let's also think about Job tenaciously hanging to his faith, refusing to give up his integrity in his walk with God. I hope you'll remember these things as you face life's difficulties. I hope that as we've begun today in the Word, that you will live out today in the Word. Thank you, and God bless.